Hello, my name is Taishya Adams, and I am the National Policy and Education Director for Outdoor Afro. Outdoor Afro is a national nonprofit dedicated to connecting Black people to nature and to leadership. Through our 56 networks in 33 states, we connect over 40,000 Black people to nature-rich experiences annually. And these connections are through outdoor recreations like hiking and biking, all the way to stewardship and conservation. And so really excited as we open up February 2022 Black History Month with a focus on agriculture and gardening and the land. And so we will be focusing on Black homesteads of the past, as well as urban gardeners, urban farmers, as well as rural farmers of today, right? That we are connected between the past and the present. And so today I am joined by the incredible Alice McDonald, who is a descendant of the Dry in Manzanola. And I'm not going to spoil the story because she tells it much better than I do, but really excited to have this conversation with Miss Alice today as she talks about her journey in being in childhood and being raised in the Dry. Also, some information about your journeys beyond the Dry. I love to hear the incredible work that you've had as an educator, both in public schools as well as in the community, and as you are an elder in the family and continuing to support the rest of the next generation as they are now in a position to continue on this rich legacy. So to kick us off, I thought we would start with, who is Alice McDonald? Tell us a little bit about yourself, Alice.
Well, I was born and raised in Manzanola, out on the dry land, and lived there from all of my life, and graduated from high school in Manzanola and went to school in Greeley, and taught in Kansas, taught in Colorado, taught in Los Angeles at LA Unified School District, and then when I retired, I returned here to Colorado. Mother was still living here, and my husband and I came to take care of her. And my mother lived to be 109. So usually when I talk about the original homesteaders coming, I tell the story through my mother's eyes because she was the one that always talked to us about how they came and when they came. And then, of course, we lived our lives there and the hardships and the good times. And after retiring, I returned to Manzanola and wouldn't want to be anyplace else.
Can you tell me one of your favorite childhood memories?
Well, I think one of my favorite childhood memories are the fun times that we had out on the Dry. There were children, families who'd moved into the small cities in Tullahana and Rocky Ford. But the fun times was when they would come out on weekends and we would all get together and go on hikes or ride our horses or play in the yard or have that gathering time.
Wow. And so you talked about your mother and, her journey here. And, I think a lot of people forget that the Homestead Act when it was first initially passed, Black people were still enslaved. Just kind of curious, how did your mom even know about these lands?
There were two sisters that lived here in Colorado, and they came to Colorado with the Swink family. And George Swink had told them, Lenora and Josephine Rucker worked for the Swink family. And when they had the Homestead Act open up, he told them, you should go to areas where there are Black people who do not own homes, who do not own farms, who do not have anything and are still working as sharecroppers, and tell them about the Homestead Act and how they can come and homestead a piece of land and make improvements on it, and it will become theirs. And so they said, well, yes, in fact, they would do it because they knew people. So they went by horse, by wagon, walking, and they were in Oklahoma. And my mother's stepmother was a teacher, and she was at a meeting, and these two women came to the meeting and were walking and talking to the people. And so she listened to what they had to say. And they were telling about people coming to Colorado and homesteading. And they, of course, painted a beautiful picture and said it was very good land and would be good for farming, and how they could come and find the piece of land they wanted to homestead and make the improvements on it and have a home. It would belong to them. And people who didn't have anything and knew that they were not going to get anything in the areas where they lived said, well, you know, maybe we should do that. And she was very excited. When she got home and told her husband about it, she said, you know, this is a chance of a lifetime. We're living here and we're sharecropping. We don't own the land. We're not going to own any. And we should go and see. And so he thought about it and he said, well, you're probably right. We'll take a chance. And so Mother said in May, they put a cover over the wagon and loaded it up with their belongings. And she and her mother and father and a niece and one of her brothers left Oklahoma, eastern Oklahoma, coming to Colorado to homestead.
And so as she arrived, was the expectations of what the sisters, the two women had said, aligned with what she saw when she arrived?
No. Mother said that when they arrived, they came along the river, and they were here in the Manzanola area, and they saw a gentleman there. And he was loading up some barrels with water. And so her father spoke to him, and he said, you know, we're here, we've come from Oklahoma, and we are looking for the Rucker sisters, and they have told us about homesteading, and we need to find them and find out the procedure and what we need to do. So can you tell us where we can locate them? And he looked at them and he said, where did you come from? And they said, eastern Oklahoma. And he said, you don't want to be here. You don't want to stay here. He said, go back where you came from. And her father said, well, no, I have no place to go. He said, I'm coming here. I'm going to make my home here, and just tell me how to get to the homestead. So he pointed south, and he said, you'll find the wagon trail going south. And he said, go south about, and he gave them a number of miles, and then he said, and turn west and just keep going west up the rise, and you'll locate the Rucker sisters and their homestead. So they left, coming out. The Highline Ditch is south, and once you cross the Highline Ditch, it's sort of a demarcation line. Under the ditch is irrigated land, but once you go on the other side of the ditch and on out is dry land. Of course, they didn't know that at the time, so once they crossed the ditch and started moving on out, Mom said they came to a rise and they went over, and her father stopped to sort of get his bearings, and she said they looked around, and she said, I just broke down and cried. She said it was the most desolate looking place. She said in Oklahoma it was green and little streams and trees. She said there was not a tree to be seen. She said I could see for 100 miles and I didn't see a tree. She said the only thing was the dry grass and cactus, lots of cactus. And she said I didn't see anything moving. I didn't hear any birds singing. She said it was quiet and still and just silent. And she said it was just a very disheartening feeling. She thought about the man, thought maybe we should go back, but of course her father had no plans of doing that. He intended to homestead his land, and so they continued on their way and made the turn and headed west until they got to the homestead that the Rucker sisters had, and they had gotten there probably 2 years. That was 1916 when my mother came. My grandmother's family came in 1915, and I think the Rucker sisters had homesteaded in about 1912. So they were somewhat established. So they stopped there and to find out about homesteading and what they needed to do.
And what do you recall in the sharing of just even that process? Was it as simple as filling out some paper, or?
Well, they went into town, her dad did, and you went to the courthouse where you could sign up and say that you wanted to homestead. And she said she thought they had to pay something like $2 or $3. And you signed up and got your name on your homestead. And that was all you had to do at that time. But of course you had to go back and establish your homestead.
Right.
And make improvements on it and give indication that you intended to stay there.
Wow.
And then after the year, well, of course, it became yours.
Wow, that's fascinating. A $3 paperwork, but there's
Well,
still
I think that's what it was.
A nominal compared
Yes,
to
yes.
and then having to really. So, what were some of the first steps that the family took in making it a home?
Well, when they arrived at the Rucker Sisters homestead, they had a couple of small rooms built above ground, but their main living quarters was a dugout, and it had been dug back into the hill. And Mother said it was actually a huge dugout, and that was where they lived originally. And a lot of the people who came, especially those who came in the fall of the year and winter was coming on and they didn't have time to find lumber and wood, they made dugouts and would dig down into the ground or back into a hillside and sort of put a cover over it. And this is where they would live until they could build homes. So they told my mother's father, that they lived in the dugout, and they would gather some neighbors together and help dig him a dugout. He said, no, no, no. He said, I'm not a rabbit and I'm not living in a hole. I refuse to do that. So he said, where can I get some lumber? So they told him that he could go into the little town. And so he went into town and he did get enough lumber to build 2 rooms. They were not that large, not that lavish, but he refused to live in a dugout.
I certainly appreciate that. What are some lessons that you think that this generation can benefit from hearing?
I think that living here in Manzanola, though we lived out on the dry and it was a black community of people, it wasn't just blacks that were homesteading, there were whites also. But the thing about it was when they got there and they found that there was no irrigation, they worked along with George Swink and they put in the irrigation system so that they could water the land. And after they had built this dam up on the Episcopal and put in the canals and the head gates and were all ready to irrigate, there was a gentleman next to my grandmother and he'd planted a field of wheat. And he said, well, I'm going to plant the wheat, and since we're working on the dam, I'll probably be able to water it. And sure enough, they finished it. And when they finished the dam, some of the men said, well, let's just fill it up partway and let it set. And others said, no, we're finished, and let's fill it all the way to the top. Let's fill it up. And so, of course, they opened the main gate from the Episcopal and let the water come into the dam and filled it up, but it was a dirt field. And in 1923, they had this huge rainstorm, which flooded out Pueblo, flooded down through the Arkansas River, and washed a hole in their dirt-filled dam. And that they were able to use it one time to do the irrigation, and it washed a hole in it. The men were so taken aback and disheartened, and they never rebuilt it. They never so the intent was to have it be a valley and be irrigated, and the farms would have been irrigated, but it just did not happen. So the people began to move away. But our family stayed, and instead of farming, which you could not do, we went to cattle. And we had, at one point, we were milking 33 cows. We'd milk them in the morning, go to school, come home, milk them in the evening. We separated the milk, and we had a milk house. And we separated the milk, and Mother would take the cans of cream into town to the creamery. And so that was one source of funds that we had. And of course, my father worked in the valley for the farmers. And growing up as kids, we worked too. Hoeing weeds, picking tomatoes, topping beets, you name it, I know how to do it. We worked, always worked. It was a part of our lives.
And I also appreciate what you shared around moving from the I or the me to the we.
Yes.
And that we really are interconnected and interrelated. And so it's interesting because I'm also reminded of where we are in the pandemic right now and the disruptions to the supply chain, right? So now the things that people are used to getting when they go to the grocery store aren't always there. And so can you talk to me a little bit more about the garden and just some of the fruits and vegetables that were in there?
Everyone had a garden, and they would have a nice sized garden. And we always had in our garden peas and green beans and tomatoes and onions and collard trees and butter lettuce and garden lettuce. Never iceberg, but it would be butter lettuce or garden lettuce, and we would have a lot of that. We would even have corn in the garden. Items like tomatoes, the farmers would have fields of tomatoes, and because we worked for the farmers and helped them harvest the tomatoes, we always got plenty of tomatoes to can. So if we didn't have them in the garden, she didn't need to worry about having them for canning. We would have them in the garden for salads or for daily use. But we could get plenty of tomatoes, plenty of corn from the larger farm source. But everyone had a garden.
Give them that lay of the land like you did when
Yes, the chicken house was going up in the direction she's going, up right there to the west. And out here was the barnyard part. And you can see the tank, it's rusted out, but we always had 1 or 2 tanks, and we would fill those with the water. And the stock cistern was right to the front of it. If we walked out, we probably could see it. Then over here was the garage. Like I told her, this was the root cellar. And the outhouse was always out. Probably back out in this area. And at night, we hated this.
I was gonna say,
but we
went cactus between here and there.
Well, I would say it probably at the peak, there were probably 40 to 50 black families and with their children, and that homesteaded out there in various areas of the dry land. And of course, they called it the dry because it was dry so much of the time. But there were times when we got plenty of snow and rain, and the land was nice. It was green, and there was plenty of grass. It wasn't dry and parched all of the time. And that's the thing about it. There were good years, and people could do well, and there were bad years, when they had the crash, and we had the Dust Bowl, and the Dust Bowl really passed through here, and it was really terrible. And
what was the first inkling that something is happening here for you with the Dust Bowl?
Well, what happened was that they had good years, and there was plenty of moisture, and so they had, not just here, but east, they had plowed up acreage and acreage of land and planted wheat, and it did well, and they had plenty of wheat to sell. So they said, well, let's plow up more. They're plowing up the prairie now, so they plowed up more of the prairie and planted wheat, and they had moisture, and it did well. So they said, let's plow up more. So they brought in tractors, and they'd have 2 or 3 tractors on a parcel of land, and they plowed it up and planted wheat. And then we didn't have any moisture, and no rain, and no snow, and no rain, and no snow, and everything dried up, and the fields dried up, and the winds came and blew the dust, and there were farm areas that the people had plowed up here. And it wasn't as bad as it was, say, around Springfield and going into Oklahoma, but my mother said that when the drought really moved in and the winds came, that it would blow so that the dust it would be dark. There was so much dust. And she had given birth to my brother in 33, and that was one of the really bad times. And so she would put him in his crib, and she had to keep him covered. And all of the families that were still here, they would take sheets or quilts or whatever they had, and they would wet them and hang them over the windows and hang them over the doors to keep the dust out. And when you would get up in the morning, the dust would be thick that had blown in, and they would go and shake it off and wet them and hang them back up. But that was the only way that they were able to keep that dust from getting in, which would have been very detrimental. My grandmother went to school when she got her teaching degree with George Washington Carver. And so over the years, she always kept in touch with him, and they would write and correspond. And when they came here to the dry, and she finally wrote to him and told him how dry it was, and there was no water, and how desolate it was, and she said, I don't know what we're going to do. And when he wrote back, he said, Lou, did you take a cow with you? And Grams said, yeah, well, they had the cow. And he told her, whatever a cow eats, you can eat. So, you know, they were eating green meal on the road. There was what they call pigweed, and you could pick that and cook it like greens. So there were different things that the cows would eat, and he said, you never go hungry, eat what the cows eat.
With each other.
Well, they went to school in Graham County in the Kansas area. He was there and she was there, and that's where they attended and got their teaching degrees. And that's how she got acquainted with him, and she kept in touch with him all of the years that she was able to, and they would write and correspond. And very good friends. Mm-hmm. Oh, we just persevered. We just said we're going to stay, and like I say, my dad realized early on that we were not going to be able to farm. So he just knew that he was going to have to work, and my mom would stay at home and take care of what we had, the stock and what have you. Dad worked. We went to school. When we left school, we worked. We just worked. And Grams and Dad had decided they weren't going anywhere, that they had homesteaded the land, they were going to stay, and so they just dug in. And it was sort of difficult to know when you were going to have a good year and when you weren't going to have. It was hard to know. And sometimes you were having a good year, and things were growing and lush, and not just on the dry, but for the farmers, and we'd have a huge hailstorm, and it would come and just wreak havoc. And I can remember as a child that Mother was very sensitive to her surroundings, and she would say, you know, I hear the hail, I hear a roaring, and she would look and she'd say, those clouds look white in that dark coming. I think it's going to hail, Dad. We need to cover the windows. Well, we would cover the windows on the west and the north because the storms usually came from the northwest. So it wouldn't break out the windows, but it would beat off the shingles. And so just take the shingles off the house, and of course it would leak then. So we would go and Dad would buy new shingles and re-shingle the house. And it might, before the summer left, another hailstorm come. It wouldn't be as bad because you had new shingles, so it didn't do as much damage. The shingles were old, it would usually really take them off. But with storms like that, the valley farmers, if they planted the onions, it would level them to the ground. If they had planted corn, sometimes it would beat it until it beat all of the leaves, and it beat right down to the stalk, and the ears would just be hanging there. So you never knew how bad the hailstorm was going to be. You didn't really know when they were going to come. It was usually in July or August. That would be about the time.
Well, you can see it.
If you look right straight ahead, you see that raised.
Yeah, it's just a slight lip.
All right,
Yeah.
That is the irrigation canal that they made going on along this way up above, and then they were going to irrigate down below. Mm-hmm.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Which would then supplement the irrigation that was happening above.
Yeah.
Right. And it just was the 1 year
Mm-hmm.
of success. Okay. And then you mentioned that when the family first arrived, they were able to purchase the wood and create the first home with the two rooms. Is it still in this?
No,
this
that
space,
was
or
my.
was it a different place?
That was a different place. That was my mother. she was Dixon, and their homestead is on further up this hill, and they call their homestead Dixon Heights, and that's where they built the 2 rooms, and he went into Fowler to get him some lumber so that he could build
Okay.
his
So
house.
then when did they build this?
I don't know. This was my father's piece of land, and he actually did not homestead this. Someone else homesteaded it, and by the time Dad got back from the service, they were ready to go. And so they sold it to him, and probably for a small amount, but he purchased this piece here.
Okay.
But Graham's actually homesteaded hers, Aunt Viola, Dode Smith, the Rucker sisters, Dixons, Narcissa Smith, Tom Sadler. I could just go on and on. There was the ones who actually homesteaded the land. Some of them, like my father, bought theirs.
There's this thing called national monument recognitions that President Biden has been lifting up as an opportunity to help preserve not only land, but culture, things that happened, the stories of people and their resiliency. And so just curious your opinions on the importance of preserving not only the stories, but also the land itself.
Well, it needs to be preserved, and the stories, but like the dry land that we have here, but I've told the children, 9 times out of 10, I won't be here, but you will. So whatever you want to do is up to you. I'm not making any decisions about it. It's left to them to use it however they want, or just continue to pay the taxes on it like I've been doing over the years and keep it there for them. But I'm more at ease doing what I'm doing now, and that's talking about the experiences that we had and the experiences that my mother told us about and the experiences that my grandmother. That is how my feeling of saving the history is talking about it and putting it in print or recording it, or that's where I am.
It's peaceful, it's comforting, and it's welcoming. I mean, it's so wide open. It's like the land says, there's room. The generation that comes after me, that next one and perhaps 2 down, to make a decision about what they want to do with the land. And just like I made the decision to leave the city, Mama Alice made the decision to leave LA, other people are going to do the same. And so to know that you have a place that you can come to. Some people want to leave and they have nowhere to go. And so the value for us is we always have some place to go. Welcoming.
But curious, if we hit the jackpot tomorrow, right? How would you want to use those funds to, preserve the dry or tell the story? If there's a windfall, just curious how, you would like to see those funds used.
Well, my sharing is talking about the dry and talking about their coming and our living there and persevering. I never think about funds. I graduated from college in '56, but somewhere in that time they got the electricity. And once they got electricity, why they were able to have, Mom had an electric stove and she had the real refrigerator instead of the ice box. And they were able to put a pump on the drinking cistern and pump water through so she could have an indoor bathroom. This is where they had the septic tank and the leach field. It's caved in now. And then there's another low spot. You see where the tree is? There's a low spot behind that. That was the root cellar. And that's where we always kept all of this canning. Okay. Because in the winter, it would be nice and warm down under the ground. That's why they had the dugouts. But we never lived in there, but it was root cellar, and Mom did all of her canning there. And she used to make beer for Dad. And so she always would put the canning apparatus and the beer down below, and when it was fermented and ready to be bottled, she would let us go down and bottle. Of course, we were silly, and we would go down, and it would be in the summer, and it would be nice and cool, and as we bottled the beer, we would drink. Then we would come out, and it would be hot, hot, hot outside, and we would be so drunk and so sick from bottling home brew.
Again, I'm also reminded of, that Dust Bowl period as you were sharing. Like, how do you prepare for the unknown? How do you prepare for the unknown?
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know. But it's amazing that we go full circle, There's an occurrence, and then things are better, and life sort of goes. It happens now, and and then we live our lives, and we reach a point where we say, this has occurred before. This has happened before. This is how we dealt with it before. So we will find a way. My grandmother always said that there's always a way. She she would say there's a way. You just have to find the way.
Well, I think that's a beautiful way to end this segment as we find our way to a tour of the Dry and actually get to see some of the places that you're actually been referring to. And again, I know that a lot of the buildings aren't there, but there's still that energy and there's spirit.
The buildings are not there, but
And
the foundations are there. And when the families moved away from the Dry, and the houses were there, but of course, the vandals were out, and the fellows drinking beer and what have you, so that they were burned to the ground, and there was no water. I remember when our home place caught on fire, the fellow that lived right 2 miles down below the ditch called Mom, and he said, the house is burning, and what do you want me? He said, what do you want me to do? And my mom called him by name, and she said, now think about it. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? And he said, I guess we'll have to let it burn, because there was no water. There was no water. No one had lived there, so there was no water in the cisterns. By the time they got the trucks together and loaded them up and got out there from the fire departments in the town, which they offered to go, they would have everything burned to the ground. It was at night. And Mother said, go back to bed. And she said, I'm going back to bed. It's changed. And I came back in 94. I retired and came back in 94 to be here with Mom. And just from 94 until now, it's changed. We don't have the rain. I think that the drought, I don't know whether I'm wording it right, but it's more consistent now, this lack of rain and lack of snow. This year, we've had 4 inches of snow last week. Before then, we had a snow 2 inches. That's all the snow we've had. That's all that we have had. Normally, January and February are the real snowy months, but that is all the snow that we've had, and that's year after year that happens. Then you get deeper and deeper. I don't know what they're going to do about the drought, but climate change is real to me. Something has changed.